volunteers. The planning committee and I are delighted to see so many of you here this morning. And I commend you on coming out of what is probably the coldest morning in Grinnell, Iowa this winter. Thank you for coming. I'm Joanne Bungie. I'm here to remind you to turn off your cell phone, turn on your tea coil, and also to point out the little cards that we have on your table and give you the YouTube site. If you weren't here last week, or if you're just interested in hearing or watching the various courses that we've had, that is the site for you to go to. And if you click on playlists, that gives you the most recent courses. And so if you weren't here last week and want to catch up on it, if you don't get it on Get 12, you could go to the YouTube site and see it as well. We are very grateful to the great community library for giving us this space each week. And Marilyn Kennett, who is the director here, has something to tell you.
Thank you, Joanne. We have a couple of programs coming up next week on February 26th and again on March 8th that I wanted to tell you about that I think you might be interested in. On February 26th, a Thursday, and I'll have these reminder cards out on the desk out there. Nancy Trask from the Winterset Public Library, she's their director, and she has researched Iowa's Monument Man. George Stout was instrumental. He was the leader of the group that took individuals from the United States and recovered the art that was stolen in World War II. And she's got insider information and really interesting things to share with us. The Friends of the Library is sponsoring this, and desserts will be offered at 6:30 with the program starting at 7. And then our Aldo Leopold Environmental Committee is sponsoring an event on March 8th at 2 p.m. It's a Sunday, and that will be featuring Larry Stone, a Manatees Iowa speaker, and he will be presenting Iowa Portrait of the Land. So I hope that you'll be able to come to these events, and thank you very much, Joanne.
Thank you, Marilyn. We are so fortunate to have this resource here in our community. Well, now it's time for the second class of Clark Lindgren's 4-class course on criminal brains. And this morning, we are ready to introduce Clark, who is the professor of biology and also Patricia A. Johnson Professor of Neuroscience at Grinnell College. Welcome back again, Clark Lindgren.
Thank you, and can everyone hear me? Is this gonna work? One more back. Turn this back down. Okay, we'll give it a try. Yep, shout out if you're having a hard time seeing things. All right, so today the topic is, as it says, criminal genes, or is there such a thing as a criminal gene? So I'm going to start off by telling you about a guy named Jeffrey Landrigan. And that's a name you may remember. He was executed a few years ago by lethal injection. And the reason that name, you may remember that name, is because that was about the time we were finding out that some of the drugs that were used in the lethal injection cocktail were becoming really hard to get a hold of, and prisons were having difficulty getting, particularly sodium thiopental, which is the first of 3 ingredients that goes in the lethal injection cocktail. And there are no companies in the United States that make it anymore. And so the Arizona prison system ended up getting the cocktail, getting that particular medicine from the UK, which was making it. And then shortly after that, there was some controversy that ensued, and then the UK finally banned the exporting of thiopental to the United States because they learned from this case that the only use of this drug in the United States was for lethal injection. And so they decided to ban importing that particular drug to the United States. But before that, Jeffrey Landrigan was killed by lethal injection. So, question? Comment? Okay, so Jeffrey Landrigan, he was born in 1962, and he was abandoned at about 8 months of age at a daycare center. And so he was brought up by his adopted parents, Nick and Dot Landrigan, who were described as pretty normal people. Nick was a geologist, Dot was described as a doting mother, so he was brought up in a very normal, fairly nurturing environment. Yet despite that, he started, even as a youngster, getting into trouble. By 10 years of age, he was abusing alcohol. By 11 years of age, he had committed theft. And then when he was still a young man at 20, he stabbed a friend to death. And that, of course, sent him to prison, where he was sentenced to a 20-year sentence. About 7 years into his sentence, he escaped from prison successfully, ended up in Phoenix, where things were going fine until he met a guy in a Burger King and ended up killing him. He was sentenced to the death penalty and was on death row in Arizona when he met a guy who told Jeffrey that he had met somebody on death row in Arkansas who looked just exactly like him. He said, "This guy is the spitting image of you. This is just really crazy." What do you think? It was his father. His father, Darrell Hill. So Darrell Hill was on death row in Arkansas. His son was on death row in Arizona. They had really only seen each other just when Jeffrey was a child, with a baby actually. Darrell not only looked like Jeffrey, obviously he had a lot of other similarities, including the fact that he also was an addict, he had killed twice, and he had escaped from prison. Furthermore, Jeffrey's grandfather was also a criminal, and he had been killed by police following a high-speed chase after he had robbed a drugstore or something like that. So 3 generations of pretty hard criminals. When Darrell Hill learned about his son, he made this comment: "Don't take anyone too smart to look at 3 generations of outlaws and see there's a link of some kind. There's a pattern." So that's what we're going to look at. What is the actual evidence that there is some kind of link, that there is some kind of hereditary basis for criminal behavior? But I want to go back and review a couple things from the last class. And the first one is to review this thing I talked about, how nature and nurture are not 2 separate factors that influence behavior, but they interact in ways that you have to consider when you, particularly now when we're looking specifically at the effects of genes. Just like I said, you can't make a dinosaur if you just have his genes. You can't actually make a criminal if you just have genes. There's an interaction that occurs between the genes and the social environment. However, it's really tempting to get focused in on genes and brain differences because they're very concrete. And we tend to focus in on things that are very concrete as opposed to things that are a little bit less concrete, a little bit more abstract. And so I just want to start off by reminding you all to be remembering this connection, and then particularly how those interact to produce criminal behavior. So things we say about genes and brains are not happening in isolation. Cold weather's getting me. All right, I also wanted to just quickly review the other thing I talked about last week, which was the process by which natural selection works to create different evolved characteristics. And so this is your first quiz. What are the 3 elements that are both necessary and sufficient for natural selection to occur? Variation. So there have to be varied characteristics, there have to be consequences, those have to make a difference in terms of the survival and then ultimately reproduction. And then the final one was? Good, okay. Heredity, so there has to be a mechanism for transmitting those traits to the next generation. What I wanted to, at this point, just mention that the mechanism of heredity is not specified here. And in fact, Darwin, when he first proposed the idea, didn't understand genetics like we do today. he of course understood heredity because he was a biologist, and he was also very involved in breeding different animals with different characteristics. So he understood the principle of heredity, but there's nothing in here that specifies what the nature of this heredity might be. And so we're going to be talking about genes and genetic heredity, which is what you usually first think of. But I just want to remind you that there are other forms of heredity. So when we're talking about social factors, when we're talking about cultural influences, those also get passed on in the same way. So there you inherit various social customs, various cultural ideas and practices in a way that is also fitting with concept, but with the necessary ingredients for natural selection. So you can have cultural factors, social factors also evolving in the same way you can have biological factors. Given the fact then that they interact as well, you can see that this is a very, very complicated story. And I'm only giving you a small part of that story, but to really fully understand crime, criminal behavior, and particularly to try to redress that, it's going to be a really much more difficult problem than you might get from just looking at a few genes or a few brain images. But that's what I'm going to do, because that's what the purpose of this course. So let's go back to Jeffrey Landrigan. So it's one thing to have a single story of a remarkable, seems like two remarkable coincidence of grandfather, father, and son all having a very similar criminal history. But let's look at it and see what's been learned in a more scientific and a more objective way. So there have been a variety of adoption studies that have been carried out to specifically ask the question, is this Jeffrey Landrigan story just a once in a million fluke, or is there more to it? And so these adoption studies have had the following experimental design. They look at subjects who were adopted out of their biological home at a young age, and since they're just looking at what's already there, the ages vary all the way from being an infant up to, like, usually at most a few months. These adoption studies try to look at kids who were adopted out fairly early to minimize the interactions that they would have had with their biological parents. They then measure criminal behavior. That can be done in a variety of ways. You can actually look at criminal records. You can actually just do a history and try to get some idea from the person himself what kind of criminal behavior they've been involved in. Or you can do more sophisticated psychological tests of antisocial behavior, personality characteristics. Then what you do is you do the same thing, but you both look at it in the biological parents and then also in the adoptive parents, and then compare. And so then the expectation is that if there is more similarity between the subject and their biological parents in terms of their criminal behavior versus their adoptive parents, that would suggest that the influence there is a significant genetic influence over and above or separate from the environment that the child is brought up in. Okay, so that's a fairly straightforward experimental approach. Sort of a landmark study was carried out by Mednick, who published his results in 1984 in Science, so this is sort of seen as one of the first really big adoption studies, in which he looked at 14,427 adoptees in Denmark. So he had a very, very large group of adoptees, and you can imagine that's a fairly challenging task to be able to find all of them and then be able to get all this information and get it both from their biological parents as well as from their adoptive parents. And then he compared court convictions of adoptees with their biological parents. And here's what he found. Okay, so this is actually a figure that's taken from the paper. And what's being plotted here on the x-axis are the number of convictions of the biological parents. So 1, 2, 3, greater than 3. And then on the y-axis, what's being plotted are the convictions of the sons, specifically just look at the males, and how that correlates with the biological parents. And you can see if you look at the total, there's a very strong correlation between criminal convictions in the children and their biological parents. Now in this study, he specifically divided criminal offenses between property and violent offenses, and in this study, Mednick found that there was a small effect on violent offenses, but not as much. Other studies, and there have been many many adoption studies that have been carried out like this, they had actually found a stronger effect on violent offenses than Bednick actually found. But it certainly suggests that there is a powerful influence. And by contrast, when he did the same thing and looked at the convictions of children and compared it to their adoptive parents, there was no relationship at all. So there seemed to be absolutely no correlation between whether your adoptive parent was convicted of crimes and you became a criminal, but there was a very strong correlation with your biological parents. Okay. So, where would Jeffrey Landrigan be? Well, he'd be way up here, way opposite, right? His father, was a very, very extreme criminal, and not surprisingly, then you would say, based on these results, he was also a criminal behaviors. So it's not just a one-off case. It seems to be a general principle that you can find in looking at adoptees, and this is, again, I said this has been done in different parts of the world. The studies have been done in slightly different ways, and they've tried to control for various other confounding factors, and this relationship still holds. Nevertheless, there's a criticism that has been used to argue against the validity or the strength of these studies, because as you probably know, when children are put up for adoption, the adoption agencies try to place them in homes that are as similar to their biological parents' homes as possible. And that's been going on for a long time because it provides much greater success if the socioeconomic environment is similar to their biological parents. And so as a result, another type of study has been done that doesn't quite have that same problem. And so people turn from looking at adoption studies to looking at studies of twins. And the way this works is because, as you probably know, there are two types of twins in this world. Any twins in the room? There should be maybe one. Okay, 2%, maybe a couple. There are two types of twins. So there are dizygotic twins and then monozygotic twins. You've known of those as fraternal versus identical twins. So the dizygotic twins, the way that happens is there are two zygotes. So the zygote is the name biologists give to the cell that's formed when the sperm and the egg fuse. So that zygote, if there are two of those formed, then you have dizygotic twins. And that is analogous genetically. The twins of a dizygotic pair are similar to just siblings in general. So the twins that are dizygotic will have, on average, about half the same genes that their sibling has, just like, or their twin will have, just like you share roughly 50% of your genes with your siblings. Okay. In contrast, monozygotic twins, which means one zygote, in that case you have one zygote formed by the sperm and egg, but then the zygote at some point further on splits into two. And so in that case they're said to be identical because they have roughly, or almost exactly 100% similarity in their genetic makeup. Okay, so you can utilize that fact to try to tease out the genetics of all kinds of behaviors. And so the Minnesota twin study, for example, is the most famous one. It's been going on for a long time, and it's just looked at all sorts of things. I mean, just about anything you can think of that you might wonder how much there might be a genetic basis to that. This cohort of twins have been studied. And basically the logic goes, you compare some feature, some behavior between the twins. So if one twin has a particular behavior or characteristic, then you see if the other twin also has that same characteristic. If there's greater what's called concordance between the monozygotic twins versus the dizygotic twins, then that argues for a genetic basis. Simply because there's twice as much genetic similarity. Okay. And the idea of looking at twins is that you're now, they're in the same home, they're under exactly the same influence, and so there's less of a chance that the differences that you're seeing are due to environmental differences that might exist between these. Okay. So what have these sorts of studies found? So Baker et al. Carried out a study, and they actually looked at 12,010 9-year-old twins from the Los Angeles area. Again, sort of a fairly large task to get that many twins, both monozygotic and dizygotic twins. What they did is they asked parents, the kids themselves, and then the kids' teachers to complete a checklist of behaviors, a variety of behaviors, including antisocial behavior. So they asked them things like, did the children, did they get in fights? Were they cruel to animals? Were they disruptive and in a variety of other ways? So they basically were trying to determine the degree to which antisocial behavior was characterized by these kids. And when they did that, and they compared the amount of similarity between the dizygotic and monozygotic twins, they were able to demonstrate that roughly 40 to 50% of the variability in antisocial behavior was explained by genetics. So in other words, there was in fact much more concordance between antisocial behavior traits, and if you were in your identical twin, was much more likely to have it than a fraternal twin. Okay? So that argues strongly for a genetic factor. Interestingly, they found that if they looked at what the teacher said, it was about they could explain about 40% of that, the parent 47%, and the kids actually 50%. So they actually seem to do the best job, probably most accurate job of describing themselves in terms of their antisocial behavior. Okay. Surprisingly, when these authors took like an average of these three, they found about a 96% concordance. So it even seemed that if they, like for example, if the parent did think that the child had criminal, like antisocial behavior, but the kid did, then they sort of included those together, and they got even a much more dramatic indication of genetic influences on antisocial behavior. They also, in the same study, they also looked at aggression and violence. And so there are two types of aggression, and I wanted to mention this now because we're going to come back and look at it next week when we look at brain differences. But they found that when they compared levels of aggression of these two different forms of aggression, reactive versus proactive aggression. So reactive aggression is if you get in my face, or you basically challenge me in some way, and then I react by punching you or yelling at you or something like that. That would be an example of reactive aggression. I'm reacting to aggression of yours. So you started the aggression, I'm just reacting to that. Versus proactive aggression, where I want something, and so I'm aggressive, I go and get it. I steal it, or I basically use some aggressive tactic to get what I want. They found that both of those, and again we'll come back to because these two end up being different in how they, in terms of their origins, but both of those types also had a high degree of heritability, being 38% for reactive and 50% for proactive aggression. So even twin studies have their own critics, and one of the main criticisms that's been leveled against these twin studies has been the equal environment assumption. And so that says that are in fact identical twins treated more alike than fraternal twins because they look more alike and they actually have other characteristics. So the assumption of this, of course, is that there's an equal environment between the identical and then the fraternal twins, but maybe that's not in fact accurate. Maybe the identical twins are in fact treated more alike, and that's why they end up being more alike in terms of their antisocial behavior. Okay. They're just, probably because they look so much alike and have other personality characteristics, maybe that's the factor. So what's the solution to that? Well, we can now use a different solution, and that is to study monozygotic twins who are reared apart. And so this is, obviously you can imagine this is a fairly rare occurrence, but there are cases where monozygotic twins have been adopted out to different homes. And so when you can find those kids, you can ask, now they've been brought up in different environments, and ask whether there's still a similar concordance between criminal behavior and these identical twins. So that study was carried out by Grove and published in Biological Psychiatry. What they did is they found 65 members of 32 monozygotic sets. And when I first read that in the paper, I was puzzled. And I'll see if you can figure that out. There was one pair, There was one triplet. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, there were 64 twins, and then there was even some identical triplets. Right. In the study, they ranged in age from 16 to 68 years old, average age 43. And in this case, the subjects were brought in and underwent a week-long battery of a whole sorts of medical as well as psychological evaluations. And this study was part of a larger study that was looking at other things besides antisocial behavior. But that was one of the factors that was looked at in the psychological evaluations. And the result was that antisocial behavior had heritabilities of 41% for the children they looked at and 28% for the adults. So even in this case, where they tried to control for that equal environment assumption, there seemed to be a pretty strong evidence for a genetic basis for antisocial behavior. Again, all of these studies have been done multiple times, and in general, the results have varied somewhat, but in general, the conclusion has been that yes, indeed, there seems to be pretty good evidence for some sort of genetic or heritable basis for, specifically genetic heritable basis for criminal inclinations.
But the parents haven't been studied. The parents of these twins.
So the question is, the parents of these twins have not been studied, and that's correct. So in this case, that was really only done in the adoption studies where they wanted to compare it to the parents. But in the twin studies, they're just comparing twin to twin.
Right.
So it's a little different experimental design, yes. But the studies did go back and look at the parents. Yeah. Or in this case, the adopting parents. Yeah, good point. So what's the conclusion? Well, approximately half of the variance in antisocial behavior seems to be explainable by genes. Okay, that's either the good news or the bad news, depending on how you feel about that. But the flip side of that is that approximately half is not explained by genes. Or if you like Seth Rogen, it's 50-50. So there's really, see that here, but it's 50-50. So roughly speaking, we can account for about 50% of the variance in the acquisition of antisocial behavior to what appear to be genetic factors, and then leaving the other 50% to other various factors that might be influencing it. Okay? Questions? The movie's not that good, by the way.
On the last screen you had on the twin studies, the 41% of children seem to, exhibit antisocial behavior and 28% of adults. Does that mean that possibly that there are children that do grow up and, they change, they don't have this behavior?
So the question is it possible that since in this particular study they found less of the variability could be explained in the adults they looked at compared to the children, is it possible that the genetic effects might become less over time as maybe other environmental factors kick in? And that would certainly be my interpretation of that. That's not always been seen in these studies, but in this one, yeah. So the fact that there was, I guess not twice, but significantly more concordance in children versus adults does suggest that maybe that over time, your genetic influences become slightly less important compared to other influences in your life, your social environment and so forth. Yeah. That's again. So I don't want to. So some people get really bummed out when they find out about the especially if you're a parent, because you'd like to think that you could maybe correct some of your deficits that you have as a person, and you can fix those in your children, but unfortunately there's some things that you can't completely fix because they are going to have inherited those traits from you. But there's still some opportunity for making some changes. All right, so that is sort of the framework for becoming convinced enough that there are heritable factors that people then started looking at, well, what would the specific genes possibly be that were responsible for these sorts of antisocial, even aggressive criminal behaviors? So what genes might be involved? That brings us to a man by the name of Brunner, who was a Danish, actually from the Netherlands, a geneticist who published what's often considered to be a landmark paper in the genetics of criminal behavior. So he published this paper in Science in 1993. And what he described later in a talk that he gave in Amsterdam a few years ago, the way this project started is he was approached by a woman who said, who was coming to him for genetic counseling advice. And she said that the men in her family, most of them had very abnormal behaviors. So they were characterized by having a lot of impulsive aggression, various other antisocial behaviors. They were, for example, involved in a high proportion of rapes, arson, and other kinds of criminal behavior. And it was a concern that she had because her 10-year-old son was starting to show signs of bad behavior. And so she was very concerned about him and wondered if there might be a connection between her family and then these behaviors that her child exhibited. So Han was intrigued by this, and he ended up meticulously going throughout the Netherlands. He tracked down all 4 generations of her family that were still alive, and he talked to them, characterized various sorts of antisocial behavior. He also collected blood samples so that he could do a genetic analysis and create a very complete pedigree of this family, which is shown here. And from that, he made a really startling conclusion about criminal behavior and also this particular family tree. By the way, sort of a parenthetical side note, if you have a problem, don't go to a geneticist to try to get an answer to it, because it took him 15 years to do this study. So we don't know what happened to this poor woman and her child, but I think probably by then it was a moot point anyway. But fortunately, he was very, very meticulous, and he carefully studied it. And so I don't know if you've seen these sorts of things before, but this is a family tree of pedigree, the kind of thing that geneticists create. And so what you're seeing here, the circles are the women, the squares are the men, of course. And the squares or the circles, if they're filled in, that means that that individual was affected. So that particular male right here, for example, had, based on the history that Han had collected, had a pretty significant tendency towards aggression, criminal behavior, that sort of thing. And you can see some other filled in. So these are all the affected individuals. Unaffected individuals are open circles. And if you've seen these before, something will jump right out at you. What do you notice on this family tree? Only the men get the disease, or get, I guess you call it a disease, but only the men are affected in this way. Okay, and
they inherit from women.
So it's inherited in an interesting way. So what do you know about diseases or factors that are inherited and only the men get it? I'm hearing a mumble. So you think so? Sex-linked. Okay, so that was the word I was looking for. So it's probably a sex-linked characteristic. And so for the rest of you who did get that, let me just do a quick genetics primer. So the human has 23 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes. And most of them look like this. And so these are called autosomes, and you can actually look at them in a microscope slide, and you can figure out the pairs. And you'll notice that they are paired up. And so all of your chromosomes have what are called homologous pairs. You get one from mom, one from dad. Okay? And they are homologous, and what that means, and so I'll show you that over here. What that means is that all of your chromosomes, the one from mom and one from dad, are lined up, and the genes are lined up along your chromosome. But you have a slightly different, what's called an allele, on one chromosome compared to the other. And so you get 2 alleles for each gene, one from your mother, one from your father, and how those alleles interact will then ultimately determine whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes and all that kind of stuff. For the case we're looking at, what's significant is that if your mom gives you a bad gene, like let's say your mom is a carrier of a really nasty disease or some sort of trait, good news is your father very likely will have the normal gene, and so that can sometimes at least partially compensate for the defect that you get from your mother. In some cases, it can completely compensate for that. So in some cases, you have complete protection because of your father and your mother. By the way, that's why you're not supposed to marry your siblings, because the probability of getting 2 really bad defective genes that cause really severe problems are highly increased if you're marrying your siblings, again, because you share so many genes, the chance of both of you carrying that defect is much higher, and so your children will get both defects and supposed to be only getting from the mother or from the father. Okay. So that's basically how it works out on these autosomes. But if you look down here on the bottom right-hand corner, these are the sex chromosomes. So one of the pairs of chromosomes are the X and the Y chromosomes that determine, among other things, I mean, there are various genes that are carried on these chromosomes, but that also determines whether you'll be a male or a female. So if you're a female, that means all of you receive the X chromosome from your mother, and then either the Y or the X chromosome from your father, and that determines whether you are a male or a female. But you should notice that the X chromosome, if you're a female, you have 2 X chromosomes, and that looks pretty much like we saw for the other chromosomes, the autosomes. And so that means that for all of the genes on your X chromosome, you have another allele on the other X chromosome that you received from your father. So again, if you receive a defective gene from your mother, you have another chance to get it right from your father. But now if you're a male, you get shortchanged here. Look at that. So the Y chromosome, you can just see physically it's much smaller than the X chromosome. And what it means is that this pair is not homologous. So you don't have that homologous pairing if you're a male. So now if you're a male and you received some sort of genetic defect from your mother, that's it. There's no contribution from your father that could potentially sort of prevent you from having the disease or having the trait. Okay. So that was the quick bringing everyone up to speed on the idea of sex linked. So if we go back to Brunner's study, when you see this kind of pattern emerging where the affected individuals are all males, it's a pretty good chance you're looking at an X-linked defect. So the mutation, or whatever it was that was leading to this behavior, was carried on the X chromosome. Once Hahn knew about that, then he was able to track down the actual gene. And so narrowing it down to the X chromosome reduces the number of genes that you have to look at. And we went ahead and did molecular genetic studies and discovered that the affected males had a single point mutation in a gene coding for an enzyme monoamine oxidase. And since we are out of time, almost out of time for a break, I think I'll stop there because the next thing I need to explain will take a little more than a couple minutes. So we'll take a break.
Thank you for taking your seats, ladies and gentlemen. We're ready to begin the second half of our second class. The reason we can't turn the lights all the way down is because the camera can't pick up the picture if it's too dark in here. So we do have to keep a certain amount of light, and I hope you can still see the screen all right. So here again is Professor Clark Lindgren.
So I thought the reason the lights had to stay up is because we weren't sure if anybody would steal. You know, if the lights were down, people might be stealing stuff from each other. Room full of criminals. All right, so going back to Brunner's work, and this, you did so good on your genetics primer, I'm going to give you a molecular genetics primer. So genes are carried, so the chromosomes we looked at contain genes, and genes are made up of a chemical called DNA. And all what DNA is, and so this is the pattern, this is the DNA, you can see there's three different genes that are expressed in different areas of the DNA. And if you look closely at these DNA strands, you'll see that all they are is just repeating bases that have 4 different letters, A, C, T, and G. And that's all your genetic code is, that's all genes are, is it's a string of A, T's, G's, and C's. Those are the different bases that make up your genetic code. And what happens to express one of these genes is, first of all, that code gets transcribed into a complementary code, which is read in the form of a structure called messenger RNA, which is really the same thing as the DNA, it's just the complementary code. So one of the things that these bases do is they pair with their complement. So A pairs with U, C with G, C with G obviously, A with U, and you can see C with G, and so forth. And so there's a matching up of those. And so the first thing that happens when a gene gets expressed is that sequence of letters gets first just transcribed. So transcriptionist is somebody who basically will convert oral speech into writing or whatever. So basically it's not changing the message, it's just putting it into a different form. So it's putting it in from DNA into RNA. And then the interesting thing happens here. These 4 letters, whether we can talk about it either from the DNA or the RNA, it's the same idea, but they form words that are 3 letters long. And so this is what's called a codon, and so this is a word, UGG, spells tryptophan. Okay, so what happens is each of these get read 3 letters at a time, and those 3 letters spell a unique amino acid, which then gets connected in a string of amino acids, which makes up something called a protein. So the proteins in your cells are made up of amino acids, and the order of those amino acids gets determined by this code. Make sense? It's really a very, very simple idea. At one level, it gets much more complicated as you move through it, but it's basically just imagine a system where you can only have 3 letters. How many words can you spell? And you mathematicians out there, if you have 4 letters, and you want to know how many different ways you can combine those into 3 groupings, you would get 64. I knew that ahead of time. I didn't just go. So you could spell 64 different words with that particular alphabet. 64 3-letter words with that particular alphabet. And each one of those words specifies for a particular amino acid. In fact, you can spell certain amino acids in multiple ways. That's why there's only 20 amino acids in your all of your proteins. There are only 20 amino acids that make up your proteins. And some of those some of those amino acids get spelled on more than one word. You only need 20. You only need to spell 20 things, and you actually can theoretically spell 64. So that makes sense. So the order is from DNA, which contains the code, to the RNA, which just basically transcribes it and allows the code then to be translated into the sequence of proteins, a sequence of amino acids that make up a protein, and then those proteins are the things that give cells and then ultimately give organisms their different functions. Now, in the going back to the Brunner study, what he found is that there was a defect on the X chromosome, and he was able to see that almost immediately because of the pedigree that I showed you. Then he went and used molecular techniques to figure out what the defect actually was. And found that it was a single point mutation in the gene that codes for this enzyme, which I mentioned, monoamine oxidase. And so what that means is that there was a single spelling error in a gene that probably had 1,000 or more letters in it, spelling out a word of maybe 100 different amino acids. A single error in one of these bases ended up turning the code from coding for an amino acid, in this case it was glutamine, into what's called a stop codon. So when your cells are reading out the code, they have to know when to stop. They have to know when to start, and then they also have to know when to stop, obviously. So they have to start at the beginning of the gene, and so there are specific ways that the cell knows to start. And it also has to know when to stop. And so there are certain words that spell stop. And what happened in this particular single point mutation is that a C was changed to a T, and that ended up spelling, instead of the proper amino acid, it spelled stop. And so what happened in these individuals that had this defective gene is that instead of reading the entire code and then forming the proper protein, the code got about halfway and then just stopped, and everything fell apart. And so individuals who were affected were not able to make the gene at all. And since this was carried on the X chromosome, for males, they had absolutely no way to make this gene monoamine oxidase. Okay, does that make sense? Females affected. So now if we go back, so if you look at this pedigree now, if you go back to this pedigree, you'll see that if you look really carefully, some of these females have a dot in the middle. And those females, he noticed, had one X chromosome that carried that particular point mutation. And then as you could follow it through, if you were a carrier, so basically you had, instead of a cytosine, you had a thymine, then you actually had a son. And this woman had a son. She was a carrier of the defect, and she passed one of her X chromosomes, which had a defect, to her son, and he actually then had the behavioral problems. Okay? So you can always see that the mother was a carrier of this defect, and if she was not, like in this case, of course, she didn't have any sons, right? So we couldn't tell. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, I can see that from here. Yeah, so she had two sons, and neither of them were, because she didn't carry the defective allele on either of her X chromosomes. Okay. So what's the big deal about monoamine oxidase? What is that anyway? So defective males do not make this particular amino acid because they receive this gene that doesn't allow that particular protein, monoamine oxidase A, to be made properly. So what does monoamine oxidase A do? Okay. So all of the neurons in your brain, and we have roughly 100 billion neurons, each of us do. All of those neurons make connections with other neurons, and so they do that at structures called synapses. So you imagine you have 100 billion cells, and they are all capable of becoming active or excited, in which case then they actually are carrying out these various electrical phenomena that are associated with the nerve impulse, which is the stuff that you can record. For example, if you put electrodes on the skull and you pick up these electrical activities, what you're picking up are the electrical activities of these 100 billion neurons, which are underneath the skull. The amazing thing about the nervous system, the brain, is that each one of those 100 billion neurons is forming about between 1 and 10,000 synaptic connections with the other 100 billion neurons. And so that's why the brain is such an enormously complex network, because you're starting off with this humongous number of individual units that are interconnected in this way. Those interconnections occur at structures called synapses, where what's being shown here is this is the presynaptic neuron, and we're just seeing the end of it. So the presynaptic neuron would be a large cell that would send its axon down to this structure here called the axon terminal, where it would make connections with the postsynaptic neuron, or the next neuron in that relay. So you have 100 billion times 10,000 of these in your brain, okay, these communications. And the way the communication occurs is when the presynaptic neuron is active, it releases a chemical called a neurotransmitter into the gap between the two cells. And then the neurotransmitter binds to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron that then causes the postsynaptic neuron to behave in a certain way. I don't like this diagram. This is the best one I could find. What's a little bit misleading here is it's showing, so there are 3 neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. These are all examples of neurotransmitters which are the monoamine class. So they have sort of a similar chemical structure, but they're also different. They're not all 3 located in the same synapse, so that's what I don't like about this diagram. You would only have a synapse that uses serotonin as its neurotransmitter, or dopamine, or norepinephrine. But they put them all in the same diagram for simplicity. But you get the idea. So you have some synapses that use serotonin to communicate to the postsynaptic cell, others that use norepinephrine, others that use dopamine. But all 3 of those share the fact that after the neurotransmitter gets released and then has its effect on the postsynaptic neuron, the neurotransmitter has to be removed in some way. Otherwise, just like I talked last week about the acetylcholine and the acetylcholinesterase and the sarin gas, if you don't remove the neurotransmitter, it's just going to keep activating the postsynaptic cell. And so to be a proper signal, you need to be able to turn it on, and then you also have to be able to turn it off. Right? So that's true at all chemical synapses. There are different ways that chemical synapses have for getting rid of this neurotransmitter after it's been released, turn off the effect. In the case of the neuromuscular junction, it's this enzyme, acetylcholinesterase, that does it. It basically breaks down the neurotransmitter, enzymatically cleaves it so that it no longer is effective. A lot of other neurotransmitters, they get retaken back up into the presynaptic cell. So there's a reuptake process where the neurotransmitter is first released, and then after a while it's taken back up. And in the case of these three neurotransmitters, then they are broken down. They are degraded by this enzyme monoamine oxidase. So now what's going to happen if you are one of these, you're a member of this family, and you can't make monoamine oxidase, which is shaped like a little Pac-Man there, I guess. Because it's dollars of that. What's going to happen? Okay, you're not going to be able to break down these neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, and so they're going to accumulate, and you'll get too much of them. And too much of a good thing is often not good. So the problem is that if you have inability to degrade these neurotransmitters, then you're going to start having effects on these various synapses that are that are using those neurotransmitters, and so you're going to get potential defects. And in particular, for the neurotransmitters that we just looked at, so dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, those are all neurotransmitters that are affected by, or would be affected by a defect in this particular protein that males with that defect are not able to make. They will then get too much, it'll start getting, you'll start expecting abnormal effects. And in particular, these neurotransmitters have been linked to things like impulse control, attention, other basic cognitive functions. And so it's not that hard to imagine why, if you particularly messed up the ability of some fraction of your synapses that use these neurotransmitters, you might expect abnormal functioning of the brain, which then could lead to various kinds of problems, impulse control in particular, that might cause you to be more reactively aggressive. So that's basically the background. And this particular gene, because of these studies and some other ones I'm going to mention, and we'll come back to this later, has been referred to as the warrior gene, because when it's defective, it tends to produce characteristics that you would associate with a warrior. So being highly aggressive, both reactive and proactively aggressive, as you might expect you would be if you were an ideal warrior. All right, what about warrior mice? Okay. So a few years after Brunner's study in Science, there was another study that was published in Science. And what they did is they genetically modified mice. And what they did is they knocked out the gene for this same enzyme, so monoamine oxidase A. So it's a pretty neat trick you can do with animals, and this is most commonly done in mice, where through the trickery of genetic engineering, you can introduce a mistake intentionally in a particular gene, and so that the animal is born without that gene, just like the members of the family that Brunner studied. You can basically force that to happen. We actually do that at Grinnell. I use this trick for studying some of the questions that I'm interested in, and it's obviously, as you can imagine, it's very powerful, because the enzyme is just not there. Whatever is being made by that particular gene is just gone, and so you can obviously ask some pretty straightforward questions like, what does it normally do? Because now in these knockout animals, it's not going to be present. And what they found is that the mice who had this particular gene knocked out displayed enhanced aggression. In fact, when they first did the studies, the technicians would come into the animal facility and find a lot of dead mice laying around that, that was kind of weird. That doesn't normally happen. In fact, that's actually an event. If that happens at Grinnell and we find a bunch of mice dead, that actually becomes an event that we have to investigate and ultimately report up the chain as an adverse event. In this case, it made a little bit more sense because these mice were highly aggressive. And so you might wonder, how do you study that? And what they did was there are two strains of mice. So CH3, these are mice that have the knockout. So they're not making any monoamine oxidase. And then these are normal mice. Actually, I have it backwards, don't I? Yeah, I have it backwards, I'm sorry. So these are the black ones are the knockout animals. These are the normal animals. And what they did is they took both knockout animals individually and then the normal animals, mice, and they put another mouse in the cage with them. And then just waited to see how long it would take for them to attack. And so what's plotted along here is the latency to the first attack. So did they attack right away within 0 to 1 minute, or did they actually wait quite a bit before they attacked? And what you can see is that in the normal, unmanipulated mice, eventually they would attack, because they don't like to be put in close quarters under these circumstances. And so eventually they would attack, but notice the latencies are way out here at 3 to 4, 5 to 10 minutes. The genetically modified mice, they attack immediately. Okay, there's hardly any latency at all. They could just basically, as soon as the other mouse was put in a cage, they would immediately start to bite it, and then they would take it out. Yes? Or, no question. Okay. Is there a question? No. I thought I heard a question, but it's my other me talking to me, I guess. All right, so does that make sense? So they basically were able to further confirm Brunner's experiment in this animal model and showing that this particular gene, when it's knocked out and when it's not present, it actually leads to very aggressive warrior-like mice. This was a really powerful study because what they also did is they took these same mice that they had knocked out the gene, and then they reintroduced it. So you can knock in a gene as well as knock out a gene. And so when they took these same mice, when they figured out a way to knock in this particular gene, and what they did is they just introduced this gene into a part of the brain called the frontal cortex. So that was the only place in the animal where this gene was now allowed to be expressed and make the enzyme. Those animals were restored to sort of normal functioning. So it's a very powerful experimental design where you first create a problem and then you can actually sort of fix it by introducing the gene. So this MAOA gene seems to be really important and a factor that when it's missing can lead to really severe aggression. But you might be asking yourself, okay, unless I live in the Netherlands and am part of this family with this genetic defect, or I'm a mouse that's getting my genes manipulated by scientists, why do I care about this, right? You all have an MAO gene. Well, fortunately, it's not quite that nice. It turns out that the MAOA gene, like most genes, has polymorphisms. And so that's just a fancy word that means the different genes come in, there's different variants on different genes. So for example, there are genes for eye color, but there's blue and brown and whatever else there is, green. Similarly, there's genes for hair that make some people's hair curly, other people's straight. So those are all called polymorphisms. And so those mean that there's different alleles which will actually code for the same thing, but they do it in a slightly different way. Right? So different individuals, and the variability in this room is due to the fact that we all have a gene that gives us eye color, but our eyes aren't all the same color because there are polymorphisms. There are different genes out there that have different, that actually code for slightly different products. In terms of the MAO gene, in the population, there are two variants. There's actually about 5, but they can kind of be grouped into 2 variants. One that's called MAOA-L for low, and the other one is MAOA-H for high. And what happens, and again, this is a mutation that's found in the part of the gene that's part of the promoter, and it's the part that tells the cell to either make it or not make it. If you have the L form, you still make the MAOA enzyme, but not as much. Okay. If you have the MAOA high, you make the normal amounts of the gene. About 30% of the population has this. So if we're sort of a normal population, there's about 30 of you who have this polymorphism. You have the version that makes a little bit less of this enzyme than others. Okay. So the question is...
And this is both males and females.
So the question is this both males and females? And the answer is yes. Now, in terms of what I'm going to show you, the studies that I'm going to show you were only done in males. And the reason for that is because the genetics is more complicated for females because they have the 2 alleles. And so then you don't get quite as clear-cut a case. You can have, a female can have 1 allele with L and 1 allele with H. And that's going to be different than having both alleles with L. But a male is either L or H. So if you're a male, you either have the low-producing enzyme, you produce lower amounts of enzyme, or you produce higher amounts of enzymes. Females, there's more of a gradation. But the same thing applies to females. Okay. Now, as we've already seen for the case of knockouts, or where the genetic defect is such that there isn't any of that gene Aid. I really wasn't drinking before class. Just coffee. As you might expect, if you have this MAOAL allele, there's this likelihood of having more aggression. So that actually does fit what you'd expect from those earlier studies. And that's been studied in a lot of different ways, showing that if you happen to have that one allele, your chances of meeting up aggression are much higher. And most of those studies have been done by looking at natural populations, kind of like the study in the Netherlands, where people are asked to report on how much aggression they experience, how aggressive they are. You try to get that by basically looking at the natural history and then correlating that with the genetics by doing a blood test. And I won't tell you about all those results, but I just wanted to mention one study that I find is particularly interesting. It was done by McDermott, and what's different in their study is instead of relying on people to report on their level of aggression or looking at other external factors, they actually brought them into the lab and they measured their aggression. And so the way they did that, they used something called the economic power to take game. And so there's this fabulous literature about all these kinds of economic studies that have been done, or psychological studies where they put people into these situations and then they can observe their behavior in very, very specific ways. And so in this particular study, what McDermott did was brought in 78, and he just used male subjects. This could have been done on females, but he specifically used male subjects. And he basically put his subjects into two groups, and so he knew from genetic analysis which ones had the low and which ones had the high allele. He had roughly equal numbers in each of those two. And then he put them in a situation where they thought they were playing with a partner, but the way these psychology programs are always done, it's always a fake, right? So the person thought there was actually a partner that was actually working, communicating through a computer with. And they started off by playing this game where they were trying to earn money, literal, real money, by doing some kind of vocabulary test or something. I don't remember what the specifics were, but you get the idea is that you're playing with a partner and you're receiving rewards for things that you do. And then along the way, the partner ends up stealing some of the reward, some of the amount of money. So they'll either take like 20% of the rewards, and the game is set up so that it allows that to happen. And then the question is, will the subject then retaliate aggressively or not? Now this is a scientific study in the lab, and so you don't want people punching each other out. But instead, the way they determined whether somebody was aggressive or not is they told the person that they could deliver varying drops of hot sauce to their partner. So this was painfully hot sauce, right? So this would be something that you would maybe like a little bit of, but not a lot. It would actually be painful. They actually weren't doing this. They thought they were doing this to this mythical subject. So then the question is, if you have now a way to be aggressive to your partner, how much aggression will you take out on them when they cheat you, when they basically steal some of your money? So if you have an opportunity then to punish them, how much will you do so? And here's what they found. So they actually used two different conditions. So in one condition, this is called the low take. So in this case, your partner only took say you get $20, they took $4. So it was a relatively minor insult, one that you might not expect to get anybody terribly worked up. And then what they plotted is the amount of hot sauce that the person administered. And you'll notice that in this case, in the blue is the low and the red is the high. And so you'll notice that most people didn't do anything, right? So 60% of the participants didn't administer they didn't feel any need to punish somebody who only stole 20% of their winnings. There were a few out here that did. And when they did it, they really did it. They gave like 10 drops of hot sauce. Okay. But the important point is there's really not much of a difference between the low and the high polymorphism in terms of that behavior. But this is the take-home. So now you're really pissing them off. You're taking 80%. But even in that case, if you have the high allele, still like 40% of people decided it wasn't worth punishing. I mean, I'm not going to make somebody suffer with painful hot sauce. They took some of my wings. That's okay. But look out here. if you were in the low, if you had the low form, you know, almost all, I mean, there was a very large number that basically gave this most extreme penalty that they could. I don't know, maybe if there were a possibility of getting 20, they would even have done that. Okay, there was sort of a limited 10. So this was, again, this study, the correlation between the MAOL allele and violence and aggression has been shown in a lot of different ways. I thought this was kind of a more clever way of doing it under a more controlled experiment, where you can actually see that simply by carrying that particular allele, you're more likely to mete out aggressive punishment when you are provoked. What about children? So it's one thing to look at adults and see this correlation, but what we might be particularly interested in is what happens to children, because they are, again, at the point where they're hopefully most amenable to some kind of intervention if they do have this particular allele. So a kid born with the MAOAL allele, maybe there's something we can do for them. And so we really want to know in children, how does this pan out? And so this brings me to a study that was carried out by Caspi and published in 2002 in Science. And this is largely regarded as probably the most important study that was ever published that correlates the social, environmental, and then the biological factors. And here's how they did the study. So they had a birth cohort of children, a very large cohort of children. Actually have the number down here. But what they did is they did a longitudinal study. So they assessed these kids at 3 years, 5 years, 7, and so forth, all the way up to 21. So they were able to keep track of them. And the remarkable thing about this study is I think by the time they got out here to the end, they still had like 96% of their participants. So this was an incredible longitudinal study where they looked at their, and basically what they did is they assessed antisocial behavior at these different ages and looked at how that played out over time. But what they also did is they divided the children into groups. And first of all, they divided them into groups based on whether they had the L or the H allele. So whether they had the genetic predisposition to being aggressive, antisocial, or not. And here's the thing that makes this study really quite amazing. What they also did is they divided these kids into 3 groups based on their social nurturing environment. So they basically had one group of kids that seemed to have received no maltreatment. By the way, they did this, they looked at these factors up to the age of 11. So between 3 and 11, they assessed by a variety of means how much maltreatment, abuse the kids had received growing up during that period of time. And so there were some that appeared to have no maltreatment at all, the lucky ones. Some had some maltreatment, medium amounts of maltreatment, and then there was the severe maltreatment group. And so the question was, first of all, again, looking again at this polymorphism, how does that play out in terms of antisocial behavior? But also, are there any interactions with the environment that they're brought up in? And here's what they found. And since this is a little small, hard for you to see, I'm just going to zoom. So there's basically, they looked at 4 different, they looked at conduct disorder, which is a diagnosis in children. They looked at how many were convicted of violent offenses, how many were, it just had a disposition towards violence, which they measured by a fairly standard psychological test. And then also antisocial personality disorder, which again was using a fairly standard psychological test. But let's just zoom in on one of those so you can actually see what they found. Because for all 4 of those parameters, they saw the same effect. On the left is the data that they received for the kids who had the low MAOA activity. On the right, the kids who had the high MAOA activity. Going from left to right, this is no maltreatment, medium, high maltreatment. Okay. Couple things to notice here, right? First of all, if we look at the kids who were in the no maltreatment group, there was no difference in terms of this particular, in terms of their likelihood of developing conduct disorder. There was absolutely no difference if you were in the right kind of environment. And even if you sort of look at the moderate amounts of abuse, there was slight differences, but these were not significant. But now these kids were found in a home where they had a high amount of abuse. It just jumps up. So this is one of the examples I mentioned earlier on where there's this very strong interactive effect. There's clearly a genetic underlying component because you do see a difference between here and here, but it's facilitated by the environment that they're brought up in. Here's a kind of a summary of their results, looking at where they combined all of the different, of those 4 different parameters that they looked at. And again, you can see that this trace, which you can barely see, these are the high MAOA kids, and these are the low MAOA kids. So in all of those parameters, even if you combine them, you can see that your chances of having various composite index of antisocial behavior goes up dramatically if you are in that severe MELD treatment group. Whereas that doesn't happen. It does happen in the kids who have the high levels of MAO activity. They do get influenced by severe MELD treatment, but not anywhere near to the same degree as the kids who have the defective. So what are the conclusions from this? So first of all, having, if you're one of the 30%, if you're a 30%er, low MAOA is not destiny. Okay? It means you might have a predisposition towards aggressive, particularly reactive aggression. But it's not destiny. It's also going to be depending on what your upbringing was like. The other way you can look at this is that, well, as I already mentioned, the genes and environment interact very powerfully. So you get this very, very powerful synergistic effect between the two. But then, lastly, if you're one of the lucky 70%, your high MAOA was partially protective. So that means that even if you kind of grew up in a, not absolutely horrible family situation where your parents were beating you every day, but if you had a little bit of abuse or a little bit of maltreatment, you're actually going to be able to handle that pretty well, better than a kid maybe who is heading towards heading up this slope. Okay, so this has been considered a really classical study because it really shows you a way how you can tease apart these various factors and how powerfully they interact with each other. So I'm going to go back to the warrior gene hypothesis. So, man, what happened here? Okay. Can you see that at all?
No.
All right. So that means the camera can't see it either. So remember last week we talked about the fact that certain animals live in groups, and evolution, natural selection works between groups. And so the most extreme example of that are the social insects, particularly like, for example, ants, bees, mites, and so forth, that form these really tight social colonies. And we know that in that case, that there are certain individuals in an ant colony that are the warriors. Okay, and really the best example of that is the species Protomagnathus, which is also referred to as the, what do they call this, the slave maker ants. What they do is there are certain individuals in the colony that go out to another colony and kill all of the adults, and then take the larvae and drag them back to their colony as slaves. And so actually then they become their workers for their colony. You can imagine, going back to these principles of natural selection, if you have these members in your group is going to do pretty well. Because you have these members, not everybody's doing it, but some members, and they are genetically programmed to be the warrior ants. And so they are the members of the group that will specifically go out and try to destroy the other group, and even in this case, bring larvae back to use as slave labor. That's pretty clear to see in a case of the social insect. But now, what about humans, which remember have this much, if you remember what it looks like, have a much messier relationship between these groups. The groups form and they actually play a role in these in human interactions, but there's also this other kind of messy thing going on where we're also competing with each other for resources. Where do the warriors come from in human groups? Okay, I mean, we have warriors, and we have to. We're groups, and we rely on being more powerful. We rely on being stronger than other groups. That's how we evolve. So possibly, this is I'm just pointing out, this is speculative, but possibly the MAOA polymorphism, which has stuck around for a long time, it's not going away. Possibly that is, in fact, the reason it's called a warrior gene is because that would allow certain members of a population to turn into warriors. And the thing that would be really, would make sense about this hypothesis is that because you have a much more flexible situation in humans compared to insects, you would want to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of who you turn into warriors or not. There might be certain times in your history where you don't need warriors, you want them to be cooperative and you want them to work with the group. Other times when you want them to become warriors because you're being threatened by some other outside group. The MAOAL gene would be perfect for that because you can control it. You can control the expression. So you can have the gene there in your population. 30% of your population has this gene. Under the right circumstances, it can get turned on. Under the right circumstances, aggression. So if there's an aggression coming from some external group, that would then turn on this expression of this gene, and you have warriors. Okay. Just speculation, folks. Okay. But if you go and start looking at warrior genes, you'll hear all kinds of writing about that. There have been various studies that have looked at it, but it's still really just in the realm of speculation. MAOAL is not the only gene. There's some other genes that are involved. There's actually several. I'm just going to mention one other gene to give you kind of another flavor of what sorts of genes seem to be related to criminal behavior. One of them is the serotonin transporter gene. So serotonin, remember, is one of the neurotransmitters I mentioned to you earlier. And again, synapses that use serotonin as the neurotransmitter, for example, as shown here, release serotonin, and it has its effects on the postsynaptic neuron in this pair. And again, serotonin is one that gets removed from the synaptic cleft by this process of reuptake. And so you've heard of this selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac and Paxil and all. They all basically work by inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin because there's evidence, and there's some empirical evidence, that people who suffer from certain types of mood disorders get improvement if this reuptake inhibitor is blocked. They then actually sort of have beneficial effects. This is also one of those genes that exists in two polymorphisms, a long allele and then a short allele. And the short allele, if people have that particular polymorphism, they make less of this transporter. They make less of this transporter. So what's that going to mean? Again, they're going to have problems. They're going to start developing problems, specifically in this case on just their serotonergic synapses. So just the synapses that use serotonin, they're going to get out of whack because they're not going to be able to take up serotonin as effectively. And sure enough, when they are looked at, obviously they have less serotonin reuptake, but when this has been studied in a variety of ways, they have much more conduct disorder and aggressiveness. And so this particular polymorphism, 60% of the population seems to have this particular polymorphism. When those people are looked at in terms of either as children and conduct disorder or aggressiveness later on, there's a strong correlation between that as well. So there's a variety of genes that are now being looked at, and they're being connected to various forms of antisocial behavior, aggressive, even criminal behavior. Okay. I'll come to this next week. I just wanted to mention, and do I have 1 more minute? Okay. So the greatest risk factor of all in terms of genetics, what do you suppose that is? It's not the MAOAL gene. It's not the serotonin reuptaker. It's represented by about half of the people in this room. I can tell that they have the genes most closely linked to criminal behavior. Maleness. If you're one of those people who have a Y chromosome, so again, that's the shorty. If you have the Y chromosome, 76% of all criminal arrests are males. 89% of homicides are committed by males. This is in the United States, but it holds true in other countries. 80% of all violent crimes are committed by males, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. Why is that? So clearly one explanation is that males are socialized differently than females, and so that could explain some of the reason that males tend to be more likely to commit crime than females. But it doesn't completely hold up. It doesn't completely, when people have done studies and really tried to look at that, it doesn't seem to explain all of the differences. Other explanations include a hormonal explanation. So one of the things that happens, that this Y chromosome has a particular gene called the sex determining region on the Y chromosome, SRY. And so what happens is if you have this on your Y chromosome, then that tells you when you were back as an embryo to make a testis, and you start making lots and lots of testosterone. And that early testosterone that you got roughly between about 8 and 16 weeks of gestation, seems to produce changes in your brain that can then be triggered later on, especially when you get the next testosterone burst as puberty, and that can actually lead to aggressions. There's a lot of studying that's looking at that hormonal explanation, but then finally, there are various neurobiological explanations, and I'll have to leave this for next week, but there are also differences in the brains of males and females, and those have also been looked at, and they seem to also potentially correlate with different tendencies towards criminal behavior. So I'll stop at that. Apologize for going a little bit over, and I'll see you next week.
Very much, Mark. I hope you're all ready for the test. Aren't you glad we don't have exams? We'll see you all next week. We'll hope that it's a little bit warmer for you to come out.
Actually, the test was I put a $5 bill.